Welcome to Friday night's video in our Master Series. This is the 87th video in our Master Series and the third video in our subgroup mixing. One other concept that I wanted to address before we get started is that we already talked about the process. In your subgrouping and in your mixing, you start with out front things that are out front, then you go to supportive tracks like harmonies and things like that, or any kind of stuff happening like that, and then backing tracks. But one thing to really keep in mind while we're going through this and to make really good notes about is normally this is a two-step process, actually a three-step process. So this is something you really want to make notes about. The first step, let's say you've got the lead vocals here, right? When you went through your editing, that you did flow editing on these lead vocals and or the lead guitar, which is the most, those are going to be the most important things happening, and the hook. Whatever was happening in the hook, more likely it was maybe a vocal, but there's lots of different genres, so it could have been other instruments. That your flow editing and your editing in there was the first step, that you really were focusing on, the flow of words, and the dynamics and the lengths and things like that. And we're really, trying to fine tune that. Now, when it comes to making them into a subgroup, let's say like I've got these vocals or lead guitar, and I've either doubled the track or I've got it the same take with two different microphones or something like that, that you are subgroup mixing it, then you're going to go in and try to detail it again, because once you start mixing them together, you may listen to it as a subgroup itself and you want it to be a mix unto itself. And so you get in there with your automation maybe, and you're fine tuning with the EQ and the subgroup processing that we're going to do next, and you're doing another level of another stage of fine tuning it. And then, we talked about in the last video, let's say that you get the vocal done and the main out front vocal, and you get done with this subgroup, and to you, it just sounds perfect. It's like, yeah, dude, I spent my time on my out front vocals, my lead. I've done an awesome job on it. Yeah, dude. And it just sounds great. It's like you sit back, it's like you could just release it unto itself onto the radio. You did that good of a job on it. And, and it does. You went in there and readjusted, did some rework on the automation EQ, and then rendered it to where it sounds perfect to you. And then you start mixing it. So here's the next stage. So this can be frustrating if you don't realize it and make some notes about it, because when you start blending other stuff together with it, that all of a sudden you're like, oh, wait a minute. Now that, right here on the vocal, and then this bass hit, and then the kick drum hit, and then there's a guitar chord, bwang, and all of a sudden, that all this great work you did on your vocal, that it's not riding well. And you got to get in there and fine tune. That's why sometimes you'll see people that they get frustrated because they've done all this work, that at every stage they did as good a job as possible, but when they got in there and they were like, which is, you should. I mean, you should. Don't think you shouldn't, because most of the time the adjustments aren't going to be that drastic. As you go along in these steps, that there'll be less drastic adjustments and repairs, quote unquote repairs, and making it better to fit into the mix, that there'll be less and less and less. Like we talked about at the end of the main mix, that all of a sudden the guy just pushes up the EQ at 2,000 hertz a little bit, and the whole mix is perfect because he spent so much time at every stage doing such a good job. But right at the chorus section, he automated some EQ to have a little bump there at 2K because of whatever was going on in the mix itself. And that's what I'm talking about. But sometimes it's more than that. I start blending this subgroup that I've done perfectly the way I see it, and it's great, that all of a sudden I start blending it with the guitar and the bass and the synth and the drums, and all of a sudden, well, no, it's not. I can't hear this word as well. I got to automate that up a little bit. I got to bring that down a bit. I got to bring that up a little bit. I got to bring that way down. I got to bring that up. I brought that way up. I got to tone that down a little bit. I got to bring that up. No. And trust me, I know that sounds tedious, and I know that sounds ridiculous, but it's true, because once you start blending, once you understand that concept and that can be true, sometimes it won't be. Sometimes you're going to bring that up in that vocal, you're going to have it riding a dB above the whole rest of the band, a half a dB or a dB, that main out front thing, or sometimes even more, or sometimes really close to it, then it's standing out just fine. That you don't, in your opinion, you're listening, you're going, nope, it's fine. But but sometimes it won't be. Sometimes you'll be like, nope, I got to get in there. On this one that you did here, it's like, no, I got to bump that up a little bit there. No, I got to bring that down a little bit right there. No, I'm going to bring that up there, and we're going to bring that way down right there. No, boop, a little bump there, a little dump there, and you're done. You're done with no time at all, and it's not that big a deal. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's a nice, really good composition, and you got the bam, bam, bop, boom, bam, bang. Who knows what's going on? And when all that stuff's going on, and the vocalist is trying to stay right above that, to where they're the focus, that obviously those are a focus also. So they'll definitely be a focus, but they're either backing or supportive to make that vocal, to stand behind it, to make the composition interesting. That doesn't mean that they get drowned out. The main out front thing is not supposed to get drowned out. Sometimes they'll get blended. Sometimes you'll have like the vocal going along, and all of a sudden you got this brass section in the guitar, and pop, 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 wimp, 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 and and it's like the vocals is right along, right with them, and you don't really want it standing on top of them. You want to bring the vocals down to where it's actually blended into it, so it's almost like this harmony kind of thing. And then I went, and he's not really riding up on top of it. It's almost like this blended thing, where he's not really on top of it too much, and it's blended, so you got to adjust it. Ooh, I got to bring that down a little bit. So oh yeah, it's blended in there. Oh, and it's like this little creamy mixture thing right there at that hook. Wah, pa, 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 or whatever is going on. And really keep that in mind as you go into mixing, and we get into this subgroup mixing, that if you can keep that in mind, that you will do a much better job, and you will be much less frustrated as you get into it. Because at each one of these phases that we go through when we're mixing, that will be in your mind, and it'll be okay. Nope, I got to go back, and I got to fix that, and I got to do that, and I got to do that, and da. And it seems like, I keep going back 10 steps, instead of moving forward, when no, it's a work in progress to do a good job. And it's all the problem with teaching this, you always have to keep in mind, is it's how you hear it. It's not how Bob, the famous mixing engineer, hears it. It's not how Randy, the famous recording engineer, hears it. It's not how Timmy, the famous master or editing engineer, hears it. It's not them doing it. It's you. So you really have to trust how you are doing it and how it sounds to you. Sometimes some people will spend countless, ridiculous amounts of time, in my opinion, on something, trying to get the detail, and I'll be going, well, I don't know if I spend that much time on that, bro. But they do, and then they sit back, and to them it's like, yeah, and I'll sit back and listen and go, yeah, it sounds good, yeah, I mean, that sounds good. I'm not sure I spent that much time, but to them, they could hear it, and to them, they're like, no, that one little word was off, that one little right there, and then there's the automation on the EQ, TK was like off a little bit and sounded funny, and he was a little like, like there was like this boxing in his sound at 500 hertz. I'm fixing that. And it's like, to them, it was a really big deal because of their perception of how it's supposed to be, because it's almost like them being an artist themselves, which is very true. So you get this fine line of you taking an artist's composition and their artistic interpretation of the composition with their band, and then you're an artist yourself doing that same kind of thing almost, making it ride together the way you hear it. So it's really hard to teach that. But if you understand that, then you'll start focusing on it, and then it will become important. You'll understand those steps. So as you go through this mixing process, that you will really start to understand why I really told you that in your recording phase, it's one of the most important phases in there, and your editing phase, it's one of the most important phases. In your first phase processing, it's one of the most important phases. It's like, well, almost all the most important phases. Yep. And it will really start to sink in why. And sometimes the redundancy thing, you'll start to understand why. Because I've found that if I don't do as good a job as I can at all those phases, then I have this mess to fuss with later. Rather than I've really fine-tuned it well here. And then in the next phase, I've fine-tuned it a little bit more. Then in the next phase, well, I might have to come into my volume automation. And when this mix was going on the back vocal, and I really had to take a real deep dig into it right there and drop down and attenuate it and let let it come back up. Where I didn't think I was going to need to do that before. It's like, well, you just messed up all that work you did. No, I didn't. Now I've adjusted it to make it better to work with something else. It's like that Lego might be perfect and you've got it perfect, but when you start putting it together with the other Legos, it might not be, you know, to come out to be what you want it to be. So you're going to have to do some sanding and adjusting and scraping and cutting on it until it gets to where it fits with everything else. So the whole thing sounds as good as it can be. Bam. Does that make sense? So just really keep that in mind. And I may reiterate that a lot, and sometimes I get rambling, but if you watch this whole series, by the time you get done, that if you can't understand everything I told you to do in this mixing, this master series, and really think about it and start evaluating it and things like this, that you're never going to become that mixing and mastering engineer that you want to be. And if you do, you will eventually rise above all the minutia and the hoo-ah and all that stuff, and focus on getting those things done and what you should be doing and doing a good job of it as far as you're concerned. Now, you will run into times you'll be like, well, I've done it the way I think that's supposed to be done, and it sounds like crap. And it's like, why? It's more than likely because you don't understand something we've already talked about, and you haven't spent the time really thinking about it and experimenting with it and understanding it, like equalization. Equalization can be a huge thing that you just don't really understand. Why does it sound like crap? Well, it doesn't understand. It doesn't never going to sound. You didn't EQ it very well, and it sounds like crap. You know, so go back and really focus on EQing it and experimenting with your EQ until you get it to sound good. That way, it sounds good. Duh. You know, I mean, I know that sounds stupid. I'm not trying to be condescending, but you know, it's because you really, you know, you've been given the information. You just haven't really sat down and used it. And this is the same type of thing. And like I said, I might be rambling, but it's hugely important so that you understand when you get done here and you go into the mixing stage that you're going to be redoing it again. And those main out front vocals we talked about, things, the hook, the main vocal, the lead, those are going to be the most important things to really, that you're going to really want to go back and adjust. That one thing. In your whole song, you've got this hook section in this song. And you needed to kick up on the main vocal. You need to kick it up here, and then you needed to bring it down here, and that whole hook sounded like silk and was just bam. And if you didn't, your whole production sucks. And it's like, that may not be exactly true, but the listener will hear that hook, and they'll go, or they'll go, bam, yeah, dude. Does that make sense? And you don't want, you want, yeah. You know what I'm saying? And just because you didn't do that, you did that in editing, you did that in first phase processing, you did it again in subgroup mixing, and then you did it again while you were mixing until it was right with the composition and sounded just right and cool and badass. And that is so true. So don't get frustrated by that, because the reason why I ramble about those kind of things and try to get you to make notes and checklists and workflows is because as you see that and it keeps getting pounded into your head, that it won't hit you like water off a duck, you know, that you just go, and what's wrong, you know, does that make sense? Because it really starts to sink in. Oh, yeah, well, that's as good as I can do it for now. I mean, I can only get that to sound so good how I think this subgroup's going to mix at this point. That sounds great. You know, it sounds great. But I don't know what it's going to sound like when I put it in the whole mix. I have to readjust a whole bunch of stuff there until it sounds really good to me in my mix. Does that make sense? So don't get frustrated by that, and just remember it's a step process. So I hope you enjoyed these last couple videos on some really important things that you need to take into consideration as we get into the mixing process. And in the next video, I promise you, we will actually start mixing some out front tracks and how to get it done well. See you in the next video.